You've probably all heard about that appalling Sarah Everard worker by the Met police officer Wayne Couzens. There's one story around it that caught my eye, and that was a story of 5 or 6 coppers who were on a private WhatsApp group exchanging messages, and now they are being investigated for criminal prosecution because some of those messages were reportedly sexist and racist. I want to show you the story here, if you bear with me. If you see that, Sarah Everard gross misconduct probe into Couzens' WhatsApp group. Now, what the story says is that 3 of them, including the ex-officer, are subject to criminal investigation for offences under Section 127 of the Communications Act. Now, the reason this caught my eye is because usually with hate speech law, the layers and layers and layers of hate speech law, public order law, harassment law, law for offence and insult law, all the layers of law. Usually there's a provision that you have to do something that hurts someone, that offends someone, where somebody is offended, somebody is harassed, or else there is an exemption if you are doing or saying something privately. So if you're sitting on your sofa telephoning your best mate and you say something that could be considered racist or sexist, that's not an offence because you're in your own home. It's not getting published. But so what surprised me was that these coppers are in a private WhatsApp group talking amongst themselves. There's no evidence from the report that what they said was intended for public consumption or intended to be published. So that led me to think I can understand why the Met would be concerned about that it might be concerned about that from the point of view of its own internal disciplinary proceedings. What I can't understand is why that would be the basis for a prosecution. So I had a look at Section 127 of the Communications Act, and it's pretty shocking stuff. I think it's certain to get abused. If I show the Act here, now that is the Communications Act of 2003. If you go down to Section 127, improper use of a public electronic communications network. A person is guilty of an offence if he sends by means of a public electronic communications network a message or other matter that is grossly offensive or of an indecent, obscene or menacing character, or causes any such message or matter to be so sent. Now, a public electronic communications network, that doesn't mean that you publish things on it to the public. It just means that it can be used by a member of the public. So your text app on your phone, a private WhatsApp message to your wife, to your brother, your best mate, a direct message on Facebook or Twitter that's not published to anyone, that's just used to communicate, an email, a private email, that would be the use of a public electronic communications network. So, and all it has to be is, if I just show you, all it has to be is grossly offensive. Grossly offensive according to what the reasonable man would think, the famous reasonable man. Now, this legislation is kind of interesting. The history of it is that it came out of the Telecommunications Act of 1984. I don't know if any of you can remember 1984. In 1984, just about, there was still only one state-owned monopoly telephone provider. You want a telephone? You telephone the government or the post office or BT, a state-owned monopoly, and you get a telephone. You're allowed one per house. That's basically it. It's almost impossible to imagine these days. And what you had then, something that I recall, was you had a thing then that was called dirty phone calls. So if you're a pervert, you didn't send a picture of your erection to someone on Twitter. What you did was I think what they did was sat by the telephone, dialed random numbers and did a bit of heavy breathing and said nasty things to whoever was unlucky enough to pick up the phone. I remember receiving one of those calls myself. You'd slam the phone down and try and forget about it. So this sort of, it takes me back to an age of innocence, the age of dirty phone calls, which I don't think are a thing now, but they were then, and the government wanted to stamp down on them. It didn't like its monopoly, BT being used for those purposes, so it enacted that legislation in 1984. I think it was it was unfit for purpose, too widely drafted in 1984, basically saying you use the telephone for something that's offensive. Whether or not anyone is offended, you are guilty of a criminal offence. That was wrong even in 1984. By 2003, with the Communications Act, it was the Communications Act of 2003. By that date, it was definitely unfit for purpose, and the government and the legislators should have known better. This is really incompetently, stupidly, over-ambitiously, badly drafted, overweening legislation. Now, the problem with bad, over-ambitious legislation that goes too far, is that it can be turned to any use. Anyone, at some stage, government can change its mind and say, well, we won't use it now, but then they change their minds in future and they use it. Or else a different government comes into place, and that different government says, we are now going to use this legislation to get our opponents. That's what the Nazis did. The Bolsheviks did it a little bit. Or they might say, as the Bolsheviks did, well, repressive legislation was used against us. We're now going to put in place our own brand of legislation that's oppressive in the other direction. And so this legislation, it never should have been drafted. It should have been repealed. I mean, it's 1984, that's 37 years ago. 2003, that's 18 years ago. It should have been repealed a long time ago. And any half-decent politician would have repealed it. Anyway, so what I want to deal with is what is the meaning of grossly offensive. So the House of Lords dealt with this in a case called Director of Public Prosecutions versus Collins in 2006. And in that case, one of the law lords said, I also agree with the conclusion in paragraph 8 that it can make no difference to criminal liability whether a message is ever actually received or whether the persons who do receive it are offended by it. What matters is whether reasonable persons in our society would find it grossly offensive. So this is the House of Lords completely failing to contain that far too widely drafted legislation. Basically, so again, to take that example of you sitting on your sofa, sending a text message or an email to me, let's say my phone is broken, I don't receive it, or like yesterday, let's say WhatsApp is down, I don't receive it, doesn't matter, you're still guilty. If you send a message saying, I don't like people in this group, they're congenitally stupid, and I don't even receive it, or suppose I receive it and I say, and I'm not offended at all, we've been mates since school, and I just say, yeah, I agree with you, then you, or probably me as well, you are then guilty of an offence. Doesn't matter that no one else saw it and that no one was offended by it. That is what the House of Lords have said. They also went on to say that, and this is, I think, quite an interesting bit. They basically said that if a member of a relevant ethnic minority who heard the messages would have found them grossly offensive, then one cannot easily escape the conclusion that the messages would be regarded as grossly offensive by reasonable persons in general. So you say something bad about that group, and that group say, hey, that's offensive to me, then it's offensive to everyone, it's offensive under the legislation, you're nicked. Okay, and as judged by the standards of an open and just multiracial society. So you can see the way they're going there. I think this was a really bad House of Lords decision. They should have taken the opportunity to limit incompetently, over-aggressively drafted legislation, and they didn't. So how did the politicians respond to this? Well, they issued ministerial guidance. Ministerial guidance is the politicians saying, don't worry, we've got this big bazooka, we're not going to use it. Of course we're going to keep it in our pocket because it's nice to have, but don't worry, we'll only use it when it's called for. You can trust us. And who came out with that? Yes, this man. 2012, you recognise him. I think this case alone shows that he's not qualified to be a Prime Minister. Now, when he was Director of Public Prosecutions, that's head of the Crown Prosecution Service, and he issued this guidance, interim guidance in 2012, saying, well, we've got this widely drafted legislation, but we're only going to use it in certain circumstances. And what he said is, the key quote is, The interim guidelines thus protect the individual from threats or targeted harassment. That was the word that kept getting used in that guidance, harassment. No, wrong answer. That has nothing to do with the legislation. That is not mentioned in Section 127 of the Communications Act of 2003. That legislation is not about harassment. There's loads of other legislation protecting people from harassment. He is just putting his own gloss on it there for his own political reasons. And so targeted harassment while protecting the expression of unpopular or unfashionable opinion about serious or trivial matters or banter or humour. What he's saying, again, this is the idea about protecting free speech. These coppers in this private WhatsApp group with Wayne Couzens, the murderer Wayne Couzens, they don't appear to have been exercising free speech and that they wanted to publish their opinions. I think that from what's reported, I get the impression they're blowing off steam to each other like professional groups do. Lawyers do it. Doctors do it. If you've ever heard nurses joking about the patients that have come in that day, it's certainly it's funny, but there's no doubt it would be offensive under this legislation. Well, you wouldn't have, all the nurses would be in jail. You'd have no health service because all the nurses would be in jail. I mean, this is what professionals do. Professionals blow off steam, and I suspect that's what these coppers were doing with in the Wayne Couzens private WhatsApp group. So serious or trivial matters, or banter or humour, even if distasteful to some and painful to those subjected to it. Well, again, in that private WhatsApp group, the only people who were subjected to it were the other 5 or 6 coppers in that group. So anyway, that is Keir Starmer's guidance about that legislation in 2012. Not worth the paper it was written on. The reason I know that is because, lo and behold, in 2013 there is more guidance. And it's overruled by new guidance. And this new guidance, it is much more widely drafted. He's no longer concerned about what he was saying about protecting expression of unpopular or unfashionable opinion. Well, now they're going to protect unpopular and unfashionable opinion, but not where it concerns matters of race or religion. Now, you can see this summarised in Wikipedia. Wikipedia do a pretty good summary of it. If you want, you can read that Crown Prosecution Service guidance. If you're a manic insomniac, it'll drive you nuts. It's paralysing stuff. Okay, Wikipedia give a good summary. And what they say is they will take into the big bazooka of this legislation. It's not going to get used, although it might, where messages were aggravated by references, just references to race, religion, or other minorities. So basically they're saying, you talk about these issues, we're going to get you. And I think that's significant. And they also say the revisions also clarified that criminal prosecutions were unlikely. So, well, we might not, we might not. So it's up to their whim. Again, this is what repressive regimes like to do. They like to make it a little bit unpredictable, to keep people in fear, to chill people's opinions and people's speech. So when messages were not intended for a wide audience. Now that's I think this is significant for a couple of reasons. What the many layers of communications law and public order law, I think the effect of them is to make people frightened to speak their minds, because ordinary people, it would take a lawyer, I think, 3 days really to get to grips with all the different pieces of legislation affecting what you can say about this and who you can offend about that, and whether this or that is harassment, and where you can say and communicate this, that and the other. And ordinary people have no hope. And what ordinary people take from it is, I don't know how to keep my nose clean. I don't know what I'm going to get prosecuted for. All I know is I just better keep my mouth shut, or I'll get done for racism. So I will shut up and keep quiet about it and let somebody else get scapegoated. And that's what people do. And it turns society into a society of snitches and whisperers. That's been true throughout history when you have legislation like this. And this nonsense about when messages were not intended for a wider audience. Well, clearly that has been thrown out of the window in the case of these police officers who were exchanging messages in a private group. Their messages clearly weren't intended for a wider audience. They've been investigated and found out about. They weren't publishing well, from what's reported, they weren't publishing it to a wider audience. This is why ministerial guidance is just the whim of politicians. The whim of politicians is worth nothing. So this means that you, me, pretty much everyone is in the frame. Let me go back to the legislation. So all you have to do is you use a public electronic communications network, your telephone, your text facility, WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter, email, putting something on a website, any kind of direct message, I don't know, some kind of Bluetooth message where you just swap it between phones, anything apart from sending a letter or talking in the street, you can be got under this if you say something that some group might find offensive about themselves, according to the House of Lords interpretation of that legislation. That means we're all in the frame, basically, and that, I think, is what that's what authorities like. I can see this legislation getting used more. What I suspect will happen is, if this legislation like this is not a sign of strength, it's a sign of instability. It is a tool that authorities use when they need to stamp down in order to stabilize themselves. That's why you have aggressive legislation like this. What I anticipate, what I actually predict is likely to happen is, if you get some kind of economic contraction, some kind of economic breakdown, then the welfare state ceases to get paid for. And because the welfare state is today the rationale for democracy. It never used to be 50, 60 years ago. It was just about getting rid of governments you don't like, protecting you from oppression. Today it's about choosing what freebies you're going to get: health, education, pensions. If that underlying rationale for the democratic state goes, then the consensus around the existence of the democratic state will go, and the system will become unstable. People who are in power will do anything to continue to feed their power addiction. And the way I think this will get used is if you get groups that governments don't like. For instance, let's suppose in those circumstances, the one that I can think of, let's say Patriotic Alternative get more popular. I'm just using them as an example. I'm not picking on them for any reason. And governments say, we don't like what they're saying. We don't like the fact they're getting more support. Let's get them. All they have to do is go lean on some politicised chief of police and say, go and arrest these people. And he might go and arrest some supporter of that political group or any political group and say, I'm arresting you for on suspicion of incitement to race hatred. Well, I haven't done it. I haven't cited anything. Doesn't matter. Hand over your phone. We want to investigate. We want to investigate you. They take your phone. A couple of months later, they come back. No, we're not prosecuting you for incitement to racial hatred. We've got no evidence for that. You're very lucky. But we've been through all your text messages. We found an offensive message, or a message that someone might some busybody might find offensive, buried deep in your text thread to your brother, or your exchange of WhatsApp messages to your wife. There's something there that's offensive. We're going to get you for that. And then they prosecute you, and it's reported in the papers, hate monger convicted of hate speech. And pretty much, I suspect there are an awful lot of people who have said something about some group: gay people, trans people, Muslim people, black people, or gypsies, or some group. An awful lot of people will have said something that someone else would consider offensive, and then could be considered grossly offensive under this legislation. And that puts you, me, all of us pretty much in the frame. And I think if society becomes unstable, this is the legislation that is likely to be used in order to stamp down state authority. It's dangerous, never should have been in place, should be repealed, but we just have to be careful. Thank you.